Okay, hello everyone and welcome. This is the first of a new initiative. This is the first of two professional development sessions as part of the RES conference. And this session, along with the session tomorrow on communicating economics, is designed to provide a taster for some of the professional development workshop series that we'll see later in the year. These workshops are designed to provide colleagues with a chance to work on various skills which are becoming invaluable for economists in different types of work. This session on teaching COVID in the economics classroom and tomorrow's on communicating economics, again at 10:30, is a taster for the workshops later on in the year. We will have full-length hands-on sessions on both of these topics in the coming months, as well as a session on the teaching track job market, knowledge transfer activities, and several other topics. Keep an eye on the RES website for more information. So welcome everyone to this, this session on teaching COVID in the economics classroom. I'm Stephen Proud and I'm a reader of economics education at the University of Bristol. And I'm joined by Paul Cowell, who's a lecturer at Stirling, Ruth Badru, who's a lecturer at UEA, and Annika Johnson, who's a lecturer at the University of Bristol. All of us have been teaching economics in the last year with some elements of teaching COVID within the classroom. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. If during the session, please, can you keep your microphones turned off? Later on in the session, there may well be time just to ask a few questions. So later on, I'm happy for questions to come, but for now, please keep microphones turned off and cameras also off. So I'm going to start at the beginning and just, I'd like the three panelists, Paul, Ruth and Annika, to just introduce the topics that they were teaching within their economics classroom, focusing on how they were teaching COVID. So let's start with Paul.
Hi everyone, thanks Stephen. Yeah, so I was doing a lot of teaching, as I think we all were, in very different circumstances. And I've always been very strong and passionate about teaching current events. And this is one of the best opportunities we're probably ever going to get to teach students and help them understand what's going on in the world around them. So I was doing some introductory teaching in first year. And I was teaching game theory and strategic interactions, and there's a whole host of things to unpack there. But also I was teaching our sort of third and fourth year students who are going to be thinking about going into the jobs market and teaching them about what kind of jobs market they might be going into, both in terms of the labour market impacts and kind of the general macroeconomic condition of the economy. So I think what will come out of the session is that it's a very important thing to do to teach COVID, but also it can be a sensitive thing as well. But I'll let others come in and say their experiences too.
Okay, and Ruth?
So hi everyone, I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay, this year I was involved in teaching, like Paul, introductory macroeconomics, but also teaching master's students a module called multinational firms. And also similar to what Paul said, I thought it was a very good opportunity, I mean, despite how weird the year has been, to give students a sort of practical understanding of how macroeconomic policies work and how a combination of fiscal and monetary policies would work in the real world. So what I did, especially in terms of introducing these elements of the pandemic into my teaching, was provide weekly readings. So the synchronous sessions were based on those weekly readings and based on discussions with students, sort of highlighting different policies that have been employed in different parts of the world. And I was very cautious of ensuring that the examples that were depicted were very fully representative of global macroeconomic policies that happened during this period. So I think students found that very useful, not just in terms of seeing how macroeconomic policy actually applies in the real world, but also seeing how different countries adopt different policies. And then for my master's module, I wanted to introduce a heavy employability component into the teaching and especially into the assessment. So I gave students the opportunity to work with a local firm in Norwich and to advise this firm on an expansion strategy, especially in light of the pandemic. And representatives from the firm eventually attended the final presentation, and they had liaised with these students beforehand. So it was very practical and very applied for the students as well. So hopefully I'll get more time to explain this, but that's it for now.
And Annika.
Hi, everyone. So I guess I had two main things I was doing with teaching over COVID. The first was a series of widening participation, summer schools, autumn schools. And the second is mainly focused on teaching first year economics students a principles of economics style unit, where they did a very large piece of coursework based on the impacts of education and the loss of education due to something like COVID on the labour market and inequality. I think across both that and the widening participation, I was dealing with students who didn't have a great understanding of economics. They were only a few weeks in. So pretty much everything I was doing was focused on thinking about, well, how can they process this, a lot of shocking information that's going on around them, and how can they use economics to structure their thinking about what's going on, to help give them an idea of how you might start solving some of the problems that they're worrying about.
I think that creates a nice segue into just thinking about how we all went about constructing resources in order, or constructing the material to think about what to focus on with students. Because one of the key problems that we experienced, if we were teaching at the back end of last year, there was virtually no literature for us to build upon about how we'd go about teaching COVID to students. Even in September, whilst there was some work about the overall impact on the economy, there's no long-term impacts. And Annika was drawing out the idea of teaching about education and the impact, the long-run impact of education being effectively cancelled for students in some cases. So, Annika, how did you go about building those kind of resources, or what were the key topics that you tried to draw upon?
So my starting point was actually something we always have in the course, because we use the core curriculum and the economy book that the core project produced. There's already a section in there on, well, how can you reduce inequality by improving education? So that was very much my starting point. And it was almost a case of thinking, well, they need to think about what happens if the reverse happens. So they had the kind of a theoretic framework to work with there. In terms of feeding in the real world information, I kind of turned to something I've used a lot through actually UCL's work with the FCO on sort of what is the readily available information from places like the World Bank and the UN and these big international organizations. What are the big numbers they're putting out? How many trillions of pounds are they predicting that's being lost? So then you compare these kind of headlines that are going on with the model they've already got from the course that they're doing. And then it was a case of thinking about, well, what's the missing data in the middle? And really the first question to ask was, well, how has schooling been impacted? We could make a guess for the UK. There's some places that have done some really good work on there, like, you know, the Econ Observatory and the IFS had some stuff that was really great for first years. But we've done so much on the UK, I wanted them to think more about what was going on elsewhere in the world. And now it became more difficult, but there was actually a really great Insights for Education had managed to pull together data from all over the place, from our world and data from UNESCO, from the World Bank, and sort of put it in an easy place. So it was about, for me, finding that single data set that would give them a sort of data starting point of like, well, how has it impacted their education? And then trying to put all those other pieces together to make a more coherent story, really.
So I'm going to come to Paul. Paul, you've been teaching some final year, third and fourth year students, and what was different about, or what was similar about how the resources and the how you went about constructing the teaching material?
It's an interesting one, and I think I've always tried to incorporate different ways of thinking about the traditional theory. So for instance, when we do in third and fourth year, we do sort of traditional views of the labour market, but then we switch to things like efficiency wages and search theory and matching, which is a bit of a stretch sometimes because it's more of a graduate treatment. But I think that the message has never rung so true before, because we are now needing to think about, well, what are the incentives for productivity? How do different working environments affect or exacerbate inequalities that already exist in the labour market? So I was trying to really draw upon some of the conversation that was happening, but then matching that to some of the more sort of at the coal face type of economic research in terms of looking at job search and looking at matching efficiency wages. And I think it's really important to kind of prepare students for what is going to be the future. So that led on to a nice discussion on automation, which we typically have anyway in our course. But I think, again, you can draw parallels there between, well, what is the impact long term, and how can we rethink how we are organizing the labor market, and the way that we actually produce output, if you want to put it in that way, in a different sense now, and how will that impact? Because we also bring it back to, like Annika, we use core. So they have core in our first year. And I think it was nice that we bring it back into sort of third and fourth year. We talk about inequality at the end as well, to say, well, these are the things that are exacerbating inequality. It comes from the labor market, and what is going to be happening with the pandemic. Is it going to be making it worse or not? So it is challenging to find resources, but one of the best resources I find is that what students are coming in the classroom with already. And I think there's almost a moral responsibility to help the students understand and navigate not only what they're going through now, but what they're going to be going through in the next 5-10 years as well.
Okay, and Ruth, how did you go about building the resources for your teaching and building on how COVID was impacting in place?
Yeah, so I think for my first year module, I sort of relied on unorthodox resources in the sense that I needed to get information for countries that perhaps were not so visible in economics textbooks or in many of the websites that you would go to find out about economic policy. So I ended up using bulletins or publications from, for example, the Reserve Bank of South Africa, the Kenyan Central Bank. So I had to do a little bit of search because I did want to give my students an idea of how these policies have been implemented in different parts of the world. So yeah, so there was a lot of searching for, okay, what's an interesting story, looking at blogs even that maybe described policies that were being implemented, but also using other resources like Vox, which publishes a summary of research outputs, and just getting students to see how these things translate in the real world. But in terms of, I know one other major component of what I did this year was introduce the whole impact of the pandemic into the way assessments were constructed. So for my first year students, they have a policy brief that they are currently working on. And the policy brief requires them to examine the reflation policies that have been used during this period. So I've had to provide them with data sets for a number of countries, monetary data set, fiscal policy data sets, so that they at least have those resources and then they can use it to fully fledge out a policy brief of the assessment. So it's a combination of using the World Development Indicators, which is a popular data set for economics, and then relying on blogs or other sort of websites that you would not typically see.
Brilliant. So I've also been teaching COVID in a final year classroom, and I was placing a large weight on labour market outcomes using empirical studies of past unemployment and looking at the impact of shocks to the economy on employment outcomes. And one of the things that surprised me and probably shocked me was that there were one or two students who really took the research to heart, that they really felt that this was something that was going to impact on them massively, And one student actually came out and said that they felt that, that having seen the research, they were ultimately very depressed about any opportunity of finding employment. So that kind of leads into my third question, which is how, what considerations did you make, and how did you try and avoid these kind of outcomes?
Yeah,
so let's start with Ruth this time.
Okay, so like I mentioned, a lot of my assessment was motivated by things that were happening in the pandemic, during the pandemic rather. And for my master's students, the assessment absolutely changed at the beginning of the year. So they were going to do what they've been doing in the previous years, just do a presentation on a topic. But then the first lecture, when I was just introducing myself to the students and getting to know them, I could tell, and many of them actually expressed their fear and concern for future job opportunities. Many of them expressed honestly that the only reason they'd done the master's was because they couldn't find a job. So I thought, okay, what can I do to make sure that these students gain something that would help their employability in the future? So I absolutely completely redesigned the assessment for that module at the beginning of the semester after my initial interaction with students. And what I wanted to do was give them the opportunity to network with local firms. And I encouraged them to choose firms that appealed to their own interests in terms of what they want to do in their future careers, and get them to network with these firms, help them to make the contacts with the firms, and then work with people within the firm. So it was not just a case where they had to do a presentation at the end of the day. They had to show that they actually had been in touch with someone in that firm throughout the whole period. And I think one of the very positive outcomes that came out from this was 3 out of the students on that module actually received, one has received an informal offer for an internship, and 2 have received summer internship offers. And some of these companies are now willing to work with UEA to produce summer internships for us. So I think and those students actually working on their employability skills, presenting in front of a panel of real company executives, I think was very beneficial for them as well. So I was thinking about that when I designed my assessment. And I think I'll just stop there.
Okay, Annika, what considerations did you make about student circumstances?
Well, because my work was mostly focused on first years, I was very concerned that they'd been out of education for a very long time and that they didn't necessarily have sort of all the skills we'd normally expect them to have to make the most of university learning in the first term. So I was definitely trying to structure the assessment in such a way that students could feel a little bit empowered, right? They could diagnose the problem and then make a proposal as to how things should be fixed. And most importantly, this is like how things should be fixed for their generation, for their cohort. You know, they're very much the ones that were being affected in the thing we were talking about. I think most students took it that way. I did have one student out of about 500 to 600 who came to me and said, I can't believe you've given us that OECD quote that says a less skilled workforce will lead to less growth. I worked really hard for my A-levels in the summer and this is just really insulting. So there was a kind of like quite emotional reaction, I think, to seeing these topics again and again and again throughout the term. Once it was broken down from her, once she could have the discussion, she was fine. And I gave her the opportunity to do a different topic, but she actually chose to stick with the COVID one even after that. So I think my main takeaway was that first year students perhaps aren't always great at reading in the first instance, and they need a bit more hand-holding to sort of process some of that information and start to think like an economist, really, which I guess I'd forgotten 10 years down the line.
Okay, and Paul, what considerations did you make in designing the teaching for the students that you were teaching?
I was very aware of some of so I was teaching a lot of first year students, and I had 200 students that I was teaching. They saw me for the virtual classes, they saw me for small group teaching, they couldn't avoid me basically. So we actually developed quite a strong bond going through. And what I wanted to get them to do was to kind of get to know each other, because I was very aware of, we were talking about lockdowns and the psychic effects of loneliness, and all of this is going on in a context where we have panic buying, where we have lockdown restrictions. We have some students that were, just desperate for some kind of connection. And I really wanted to try and emphasize the social aspect of learning. So I got students to get into groups of about 5 or 6, and they worked throughout the 2-3 months period that I had with them to produce this digital artifact at the end, where they could say what really interested them on the course, and they had to record a video basically, or a digital poster or something. But it was just their opportunity to explain or explore vaccine development or mask wearing, or these kinds of things that were they were very interesting. But also it's a sensitive topic, so I was also holding regular help desks, and students could opt out of this if they wanted to, because I didn't want to force anyone into this kind of situation of being confronted by a sensitive topic. But also I think there's an empowering possibility of being able to, as we were saying, diagnosing and maybe trying to find solutions to these problems. So yeah, it was a really exciting and interesting time, and I did feel it was a very rewarding challenge teaching first year students from around the world in their bedrooms. But it was something that I really do feel brought us all together.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes available for questions. This is a slightly odd platform for asking questions, but if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please turn your camera on, raise your hand, and then I'll come to you. Clodagh Jenkins.
I was just wondering if people had ideas on how to teach COVID in the future. I mean, it was very sort of relevant at the time, but what people thought they'd take going forward from it.
Okay, so I think I'll start there with Paul. Any thoughts about how you might go about teaching COVID in the future?
Delicately, I think, especially next year when this still might be quite fresh in the minds. But I think as we go on, there'll be a much greater resource base to draw upon in terms of both data and research. I mean, one of the things that came to my mind was thinking about the tragedy of the commons in terms of vaccine uptake, and how, again, we can tie that into inequality and the behavioral aspects of how people make choices. So I think trying to bring together some of the threads, I think, is going to be the one thing I want to embark on for next time.
Okay, Annika or Ruth, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that in terms of, especially my first year macroeconomics module, I think it would be great for students to see how policies have differed during this period, because if we all notice, modern monetary theory has suddenly become much more popular, and it's always been very fringe economics that no one talks about. But this year, it is something that I've incorporated into my teaching to give students another perspective on how economic policies could be deployed in a very different and otherwise unorthodox manner. So I think there are a lot of things that I personally would keep in how I've sort of structured this year's teaching to give students a broader overview of what the world of economics looks like.
Annika, anything to add? Or?
Nothing big. I was just going to say, I think one of the things that I liked talking to my students about and will probably use in the coming 5 years is how important data is to answer the questions we need to respond to COVID, but how difficult it was to have that data at the time it was happening, and sort of thinking about how you collect data at scale, at pace. It's kind of a cool power story about economics, I think, and that's probably something I want to build in there more.
Okay, thank you. I think I may be jumping, but Karina Pavlidze, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the insights. These are very interesting. May I briefly ask a question to Ruth? I was really inspired by an example that she mentioned with regards to the assessments that she had and networking with firms. well, I'm really curious how students were interacting with firms and what were the suggested ways of getting in touch with them. So how that's could you please explain this assessment? Really interesting. Thank you.
Yes, to put it as succinctly as possible. So I wanted students to make the initial contact with the firms. So I gave them a draft email that they could send to firms, and they could use any platform. They could go on the website of the firm, find the contact address, or go on LinkedIn. And many of them chose LinkedIn. And in fact, many of them were able to, one of the groups worked on Repack, which is, I think, a Swedish-based firm, and they were able to get in touch with the CEO of the firm via LinkedIn. And so after making the initial introduction, they had to explain the assessment to them that they wanted to advise them on an expansion strategy, especially in the midst of COVID, and ask for a meeting. So for many of the groups, they had several meetings with several members of the company and invited them to their final presentation. So when they made that initial introduction, that was when I came in, thanked them for helping the students out, providing them relevant data, and gave them the details of the presentation date. So it was sort of I wanted them to make the initial contact, and then I followed up, and they came to the presentation, and many of them were very impressed with the work that the students had done. And I would admit that I had to do much more formative than I had planned to do, because I wanted to make sure that the students showed the school in a good light at the end of the day. So that meant more work, but yeah, I think the students really appreciated it. A lot of them felt like they had more clarity on what they wanted to do for their careers in the future more than they did when they were coming in.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware that we are very close to time now, so I'm going to just wrap things up. But one of the key resources that I made an awful lot of use of in teaching COVID this year was the Economics Observatory. And this is going to act as a little bit of a trailer for tomorrow's session. I believe that in the Communicating Economics session, Ramesh will be talking somewhat about using the Economics Observatory in order to communicate economic ideas to the general public. And that in itself was a very, very useful resource that I found for drawing upon a wide range of research ideas that weren't yet at publication stage, but would allow us to shape teaching in order to help students to understand general and key ideas. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Remember, there is tomorrow's professional development session, which is focusing on communicating economics. Please do come along to that one as well. And thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.